House to order. On opening government, we have MARAnda Kerr. Opening opposition, we have WSDC. Closing government, we have SMUka. Okay. Closing opposition, we have Powerpuff Girls. My name is Alison. I'll be your chair for this round. On the motion, this House believes that the Black Lives Matter movement anti-police stance will do more harm than good to the African American community. I'll call on the Prime Minister to defend the motion and stance in his name. Okay.
It is a noble goal, and we will not argue with that. But whether or not the means justify what happens to the lives of these African Americans, that is what happens in this debate. Because by fiat, this debate allows for us to call that there is an anti-police sentiment within these movements, and essentially that will harm the community that we're going to be talking about. So yes, we can agree that certain moves by this movement is constructive to a certain point. However, the more visceral and more lasting impacts come from the more vitriolic and more like violent sentiments that come in forms of things like protests, in things like riots, in things of police attacks that happen across the United States that goes beyond simple civil disobedience, Madam Chair. So with this regard, we think it's more harmful that these things happen rather than the more constructive points that these people at that side opposition would most probably talk about in this debate, right? Ideally, side opening government wants a world, sit down. Ideally, side opening government wants a world where civil rights are fought based on the principles which we've always fought for them on, right? Things like constructive engagement, which leads to a more organic transition into more lasting change, rather than you basing your civil rights movement on more violent or sporadic attacks that in the end loom over your movement and then becomes ammo for that movement to be able to be unhinged later on in the long run, right? So in this debate, we have to look at a couple of things. Firstly, do we agree with the ideas that the Black Lives Matter movement sort of the BLM movement propagate? Secondly, does it achieve the sort of stability and sort of standing in community that they want? And thirdly, what is the kind of community that in the end exists as a result of this BLM movement? In my speech, I'll talk to you about the relationship that this BLM movement cultivates with the police enforcement, and I'll be analyzing this based on things like responses towards the law enforcement, how police will react towards these communities as a result of this anti-police stance as well. Moving on. Firstly, Madam Chair, we'll tell you that the immediate sentiment or the immediate reaction to such an anti-police stance is that law enforcement will be immediately antagonized by these sort of movements. Yeah. So essentially what happens right now is you immediately force them to take the defensive. So firstly, they'll either immediately try to find ways to fill in the gaps and immediately try to defend every position they take, or secondly, you see them form pockets of opposition to go against the BLM movement. So you can see this happening in the United States of America as well. So as a counteract to the BLM movement, they have the police organizations have already started organizing things like All Lives Matter or All Police Lives Matter, for example. Yeah. What happens right now is, instead of co-opting the movement that the BLM sort of propagates, you create an opposition to it. And this opposition is much more stronger when it's able to leech off pre-existing dominant structures like the police organization and the massive support from the bigger communities in the United States. Or it also plays off things like police camaraderie, that you're always supposed to have one person's back. So instead of just a localized movement in Missouri, for example, supporting this movement, you have all 50 states of America, all the police districts in America supporting these movements instead of supporting the All Black Lives Matter movement, which seems isolated now in comparison. Therefore, when it's time for this movement to make that sort of traction, it loses the traction that the movement that these police movements essentially have. What happens right now is now people react to the BLM movements in a more harmful light, because essentially the more visceral impacts that the BLM takes is things like riots, things like protests that happens. And it's easier to delegitimize these movements when it's easy to point your finger that they're being they're being the trigger happy people on your side, rather than the noble policemen that are simply having their friends' backs. So from a social standpoint, you're more likely to vote on those movements rather than the BLM, and that creates them, and that creates the sort of opposite mentality that will hurt the BLM later on. But it's important. But why is this important, Dixie? But why is this important? Because we think that it's important for the African American community to have people within these police structures to help create change from the inside. It will be great to have a police commissioner that was friendly towards all African American lives, as opposed to there being rather few individuals that will be immediately subsumed by the massive people supporting the opposition towards the BLM, and we think that that's harmful. But secondly, how will law enforcement react to these movements? How will they react more? Secondly, we think that they will be apathetic towards these movements because immediately there is an anti-police sentiment on them. So it can be as simple as them not wanting to engage with this community, not having patrols because they fear for their lives, Madam Chair. But in the instance where this happens, for example, if you do have these patrols, they'll play on this sentiment and be more aggressive, because immediately there is this underlying sentiment that you are already against me and therefore I have to repay that. You must be doing something bad, for example. So more black people will be stopped and stuff like that, Madam Chair. But the reaction that this community takes towards the police enforcement is even more perverse. But before I move on, I'll take closing.
So how does side government pose to reform discrimination currently against African Americans by police?
I mentioned that already in my first minute of speech. We ideally would support a world where you can forward this through things like constructive engagement, things through Congress and whatnot in a more constructive way, rather than you having vitriolic sentiments on the ground that BLM plays on, right? But the reaction towards law enforcement is even more harmful now. Because on a base level, we can simply tell you that people, because of this sentiment, people will be less trusting towards police officers, and thus will be less likely to report crimes, less likely to allow police officers to investigate their neighborhoods and whatnot. But secondly, we think that in the instance where police officers do investigate them and do arrest these individuals, they'll be more aggressive because they immediately think that these police officers have something against them and they are playing off that sentiment. So because of this struggling and battling narratives, there's an inability for these individuals to find a common ground where they can lead to a better system where law enforcement and justice can be served, because you immediately think the other party has it in it for you, Madam Chair. And we think that that breeds a culture where you're more likely to create more lives lost, more likely to create more injustices, and everything that the BLM stands against. I have never been prouder to propose.
Prime Minister. So the debate from opposition, I'd like to call upon the leader of opposition to here.
Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and Michael Brown. Not too long ago, these weren't just names. These were people taken away from us by a police force who has for years been discriminating and killing innocent African Americans. We support the anti-police stance because that is the only way we can unify our people against a system that is built against us. Before I move into the arguments, there's one question in terms of response to opening government. Will organic change work, and will we push the white people away from us? We think that quantitative change always leads to qualitative change. This means that even if organic change was to work, we need to contribute to that somehow. And the way we contribute towards this transition is showing white people that we will not be timid and docile when they keep killing our black people. And that's why we have rallies. That's why we make it clear and make it a point that we will fight for our rights. And in order for that organic change to occur, that's when white individuals are forced to cooperate with us in order to create a society that is not violent, in order to prevent these riots from happening. But what happens if we push these police forces on the defensive and they form pockets of groups? We think that's wonderful, because now you make it much more easier to identify the racist policemen who would not be willing to compromise to helping African individuals protect their rights and protect their lives. So you allow us to find individuals who are racist and bigot and put them behind bars before they have the ability to shoot another Trayvon Martin down. But if white people and the police wanted to have support us in the past, they would not put thousands of us in jail. They would not kill us unwarrantedly. So we think it's hard for you to prove that these white individuals would have supported us regardless if we were quiet, because they already don't. And here's why. They don't care about us. They don't care about us because we live in our ghettos, because we are the individuals who can apply for their high and fancy jobs. That's why, at least on our side, the comparative is, if we can't depend on white people for safety, we need to depend on ourselves for safety. And that's when we unify African Americans by creating a Black Lives Matter group that makes it a proper community and support structure for individuals who are hurt by the police. We can't expect to go running towards a white person who will not have cared anyways. How do we then regulate white people? We think that now, when the white people are forced to answer for their actions, they're forced to diversify their police forces. So one, if you want to quell these risings, you at least put more black people in these groups as well. And we don't see this as being a bad thing, because you at least increase the amount of diversity and protection that one person could have. And this, when you allow more people to opt into your police system when they know it's not run completely by white people. Or two, we think now police individuals are forced to be more careful. The problem before wasn't that they didn't know what they were supposed to do. The problem before was they didn't care if they were being careful or not. And that's why it's okay for them to go into these ghettos and act violently, because they know they won't have to be accountable. But when they know that they can be publicized in the media and scrutinized by all individuals, that's when you'll increase more patrols into these ghettos and you'll incentivize them to not act out of lines. But before I move into my arguments, yes, Moya.
So what is the most likely reaction by the police force the moment these African Americans show them that you don't need them, that we are okay with antagonizing you?
The most likely reaction from the police force will be, oh shit, because now Darren Wilson is made the object of hate for the police force, and because that the idea is not that we don't need the police force, the idea is we need a police force that is not corrupt, that it does not abuse their powers. The police aren't going to go extinct in your world. You're still going to have the police, who are still going to have to help African American people. So how do you create a police force that helps African American people more? When they are forced to change, not when they make the decision whenever they want to change. My argument on how we create a more accountable society for African Americans. The frame of this argument is, we live in a world that structurally discriminates minorities. These are individuals who do not have an access to opportunities, but most importantly, protection. How? Because 1 out of 4 African Americans are in jail because of Bill Clinton's Security Act. George Zimmerman and Darren Wilson are still free men who can live on their own terms. The Black Lives Matter group is highly effective because finally we have a group that unifies the African American community. When we bring people in together for rallies and protests, we have a group that empowers the struggle to these individuals by adding numbers to a cause. But most importantly, it garners attention. So what are the benefits of this then? We think that firstly, we provide a community for African Americans, because what exists currently is a fear that we can't go towards the police, a fear that if the police harm us, we won't have anyone to protect us. What we do is we reduce the amount of fear that these individuals feel, because now they won't have to hide from the police, because they know that there's a community that will be willing to help them whenever they are abused. But more importantly, we think on our side, these individuals are more likely to engage with the police, because they'll know that the police are forced to take their accounts, their problems into account and view it seriously, when if they don't, they can't really receive backlash from a community. And this is when we'll have individuals more likely to walk up towards the police. This is when we'll have individuals more likely to report towards the police, because they know that the police won't pull out a gun and say, oh, he was acting suspiciously. You can be scrutinized for that. The comparative is, in your world, they would have been alone and broken up, whereas in our world, we have a community stand for them. But even if that does not happen, we think we provide support structures. And this is when we allow stories to be made into protests. Because Eric Garner died, but Erica Garner, now a leader of the Black Lives Matter group, makes his story one that is known by everyone and makes his story the pinpoint of this group. And that's when we force police to take accountability of previous mistakes that they made. They can't just brush it off as something that they did on a one-off time. It allows African Americans to come together and care for the stories of individuals who were hurt before and individuals who were neglected. The second thing it does is that it empowers the fight for protection. Because the Black Lives Matter group represents a large block of individuals. And when we have a large block of individuals, this means that politicians and the media have a larger incentive to focus on them. How is this beneficial for us? It enables us to lobby for structural change that would have otherwise been diminished when we have it broken up in separate groups. For example, if Bernie Sanders knows that he needs to win the vote in South Carolina, then in order to win that vote, he's going to have to appease the black majority, which happens to be part of the Black Lives Matter group. What does this mean? This means making sure that we demilitarize police or make the police more accountable to get more of these votes into our party. So one, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton both won these votes. At best, we have these individuals competing to make policies that affect African Americans the best in order to win their votes and make sure that they're on our side. But we also think that it incentivizes the media to engage with this. Why? Because even if we live in a horrible world, we don't think that Darren Wilson and George Zimmerman should get away with what they've done. So at least now when we have the Black Lives Matter groups having protests and rallies, and the media is forced to report on these things, even if George Zimmerman goes free, you'll have his story being reported by the media day in and day out, and have the most amount of people hear what he's doing and hear why what he's doing is wrong and why the police shouldn't be allowed to act in such a way. So the next time we see a policeman, the next time we see anyone acting out of line, we will know that there's a community to protect us, and we will know that this individual needs to be accountable for what he's going to do.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. In that case, from side of the government, I would call for Deputy Prime Minister. You have the floor. Okay.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the beauty of the message from Martin Luther King Jr. was that he was able to coalesce the stories and narratives as well as the struggles of the African American community to be able to fight for the civil liberties that were accorded as well as were a God-given right to the African American community without having to pander towards the most racist, anti-white individuals, without having to propagate vitriol towards the communities that were so vitriolic against those individuals as well. Because sharing your stories and telling people of your struggles and fighting for your rights does not need to come with the same message of vitriol, hate, as well as xenophobia that occurs with the Black Lives Matter movement on that side of the house. That's why it was a false comparative for the opposition to say that in the comparative of the government, there was apparently an absence that individuals stay quiet and docile while they were being killed on the streets. Individuals can still protest, but the difference is we say we don't need to say that we hate the police in order to say we want fairer treatment under our side of the house. That's why the opposition was unreasonable to place that comparative on us in this debate. I'm going to deal with a few issues in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to deal with the perceptional value in regards to how the Black Lives Matter movement approaches civil liberties. Secondly, I'm going to talk about police cooperation, which is, by the way, an essential component in regards to getting the police to be able to enforce the law the way you want them. You have to first get them to co-opt into your particular methods. But thirdly, I'll talk to you about what unifying people actually means in terms of co-opting political support from other groups that may not share your interests. Because the opposition in this debate screamed unifying people and scream getting people to change and forcing people to change without actually telling us how is it that saying that we hate the police and then having 7 police killings already happen in 2016 alone is going to get anyone to support or jump onto your bandwagon on that side of the house. We think that was a thorough leap of logic, ladies and gentlemen, in regards to how you get the political narrative on your side in that house, acknowledging that Fox News is still going to control the narrative. Firstly, let's talk about perceptual damage. First and foremost, I think there was absolutely no response by Siddhartha whatsoever in regards to Moyat's material, in regards to how you delegitimize movements, but at the point at which you say that they are violent as well as they are being unreasonable, ladies and gentlemen. It is exceptionally important to then acknowledge the American context. What is the American context? With a massive majority of white individuals, which have privilege, ladies and gentlemen, are unable to understand the lived experience of the African American communities and are consistently every day messaged and told by the mass media that black people are violent or black people are X or Y, ladies and gentlemen. Having Fox News then report on a Black Lives Matter movement individual, ladies and gentlemen, committing violence against a police officer, then confirms that bias towards those individuals and those voters at the end of the day. You have to tell me, how do you change minds on your side of the house when you keep on confirming that yes, I am a violent individual, that I'm going to attack police, ladies and gentlemen, and I don't want anything constructive to happen on your side of the house. You can't scream you want change and then not provide anything constructive at the end of the day. Because guess what, guys? People love police officers in America as well. That's why you see so much reluctance in the United States of America to criticize police, because there is a cultural norm, ladies and gentlemen, in the United States of America to love police enforcement on that side of us by the white majority on that side of the House. That's why you need to then transcend confirmation bias on your side of the House to be able to co-opt their support on that side of the House as well. Secondly, let's talk about whitewash narratives, because we think it's exceedingly important to acknowledge in this debate that there is a perverse incentive for Fox News to overtly focus on the most violent acts in this particular regard. Because you cannot tell us that the white 50-year-old American that lives in Missouri is not going to turn on Fox News and every night see the narrative of black people being violent, ladies and gentlemen, and are not going to vote accordingly on that side of the House. You want to talk about Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, but what if nationally, ladies and gentlemen, you are pushed by the white majority that now thinks that black people are violent, ladies and gentlemen? They have less political support than to be able to support the reforms you want on your side of the House. That's why you needed more analysis, Sid, rather than just shouting you wanted reform. You need to tell us how you get the support of that reform at the end of it. That's why perceptual bias actually plays harmfully in this particular regard. Sit down, Sid. Secondly, let's talk about how to get less likely cooperation from the police. Ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that police enforcement is an institution of force and enforcement onto the community. This means perception of power and control over your communities is exceptionally important to maintain as a police institution. Sure. What happens at the point at which police enforcement, it now needs to concede to the demands of an organization that threatens at the point at violence, police enforcement, or even communities, ladies and gentlemen. Police enforcement is less likely to cooperate because you need to now show that you're giving in to violent acts, violent terrorism, or what Fox News deems to be localized domestic terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. What you have is at least 52% of the community, ladies, Republicans, that are unwilling to give in to these particular demands because it's giving in to domestic terrorists on that side of the House, ladies and gentlemen. At the very least, you tell us how you build a constructive narrative to get both sides of the political spectrum to buy into that particular language. When you say that police enforcement is now weak, police enforcement is now going to give in to the demands of people who are violent, at least on the outside, comparatively, we are more likely to get people on board. But thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, before I go on, yes, sir.
You said that you were going to have protests anyways to unify the black individuals. So we don't understand what the soft case is. Will you or will you not have individuals act violently in order to get their rights protected?
I maybe read a history book. You can protest and say we need rights without saying I hate you while I'm saying I want those rights, right? It's so simple. I don't understand why you don't know that. So unifying our people, ladies and gentlemen, there is a structural reason why unifying people only comes at a point at which you overcome numerical disadvantage as well as co-opting people's support. Ladies and gentlemen, let's acknowledge that the black people, even if we take Sid's argument at its best value and say unify all black people are still numerically disadvantaged in the broader scope of American politics. And what that means, ladies and gentlemen, that an essential component of creating social change in this particular regard is co-opting white support, co-opting police support, ladies and gentlemen. Like what Moya told you, co-opting police support means having a friendly police commissioner, having friendly police officers to be able to create change from the inside, ladies and gentlemen. This means that if you isolate as well as you push away white American support or you push away police support in this particular fight, ladies and gentlemen, you are less likely to get the numerical advantage that is absolutely necessary in order to push politicians in order to support your changes. You cannot say that we want to stay a hermit community and say that yes, we want to unify all black people, although they didn't prove that all black people will actually support violent methods, ladies and gentlemen, that you can sacrifice the support of the rest of America in order to achieve your change, when this is a change for the whole of America, ladies and gentlemen. I am exceedingly proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for your speech. Now,
Here, here.
Guys, insofar as we recognize that the police abuse that happens specifically towards African Americans, and we don't accept that the police are racist, is that extent where you can say that yes, we can cooperate with the police. Yes, we can still get them to change. Yes, organic change will happen. Guess what? It's 2016. We still see police taking in a disproportionate amount of black individuals, and disproportionate people being stopped on the roads for no clear reason, saying that it's insidiously looking suspicious. We will say that insofar as you recognize that the police are in fact historically racist because of historical norms and because there's an overwhelming presence of white individuals there, is that far that we still have to accept that the Black Lives Matter movement still has to take a stance against the police in general, because they are racist, and that's what's important. Before I go on to my argument, about how the causes pursued by the Black Lives Matter movement should be reflective of their racial struggles, few points of rebuttal. But before that as well, a clarification. So yes, we're fine with these. We're fine with African Americans all coming out and supporting riots and protests, but you cannot dramatize here and say that they'll go out and actually create violence or create and kill other police officers, right? That's a crime, that's a terrorist group, we're an activist group. No, thank you. They will say that we do support civil disobedience, but we support much more than that in the form of protests and riots, right? But before that, let's do the comparative. To civil disobedience. No, thank you. Like honestly, since when has this ever worked? We will accept that Martin Luther King did a great job, but you also have to recognize that a lot of insidious biasness and insidious racism still exists, and this is the legitimacy that the police force uses to bring people into custody, disproportionately targeting the African American communities. No, thank you. Which is why, due to aggressive policing, this is why you put them behind bars, and therefore put them behind bars for the rest of their life. They cannot access jobs after that, and are more likely to end up within crime. But more than that, their second argument about how police will now actually fight against the Black Lives Matter movement, and now it's harder to arrest actual crimes because it becomes a racial issue. We will say this is good because only when Beyonce goes up and creates this controversial dance supporting anti-police stances. No, thank you. Only when she goes up and creates a controversy about all the Black lives dying due to police custody. No, thank you. That is when people actually start talking about it and discussing about it. The comparative is they are already racist newscasters. They are already racist white majority, which control the vast majority of networking and connection and any dissemination of information within that community, where people will never know about the true fight of the Black community against the police stance in particular, right? As opposed to the Black Lives Movement having a lot of traction and telling people about this. No, thank you, because only when these controversial things happen, that is when we can recognize it. But even if it's true that there is more hatred between African Americans and police will either abuse African Americans more, or the converse happens, where African Americans are less likely to cooperate with the police. Why is this better under our case? We will say, because now at least we have the social spotlight onto this. Now, every interaction between the police and an African American will be scrutinized. This means even though it's not actually racism, it's a legal issue, we can call it racism. We can actually point the finger there and say that we should go against all forms of racism. This means the more details we get onto that interaction is the best form of adjudication that we can say whether that was or was not a racial issue, and we prevent any kinds of any insidious racism in future. No, thank you, because now everybody is looking towards it, and we will say, and this is better. This is better even if people are less likely to cooperate with the police, right? Because even if you're less likely to cooperate with the police, at least now the instances where you do this, people know why you're doing this, and they can investigate further. No, thank you. Final point of rebuttal: how you reduce the legitimacy of the Black Lives Matter movement, and now they're seen as violent. This doesn't fly because not all members of the Black Lives movement are African Americans to begin with. So you cannot say that the blame will be deflected off towards them. We see many white people, rational white people, coming out and supporting this, going against police custody. Many supporters of Beyonce were in support of her doing the anti-police stance. You cannot say that all the blame will go towards the African American community, right? No, thank you. But even if this is true, we will say that it is a better comparative to be seen as violent as opposed to not achieving social awareness, right? So Mifzal talked about Fox News dramatizing all kinds of things towards making African Americans look bad. It's not like it doesn't happen in status quo. They already look bad, right? So on their comparative, would you rather have a Fox News making them look more evil or as murderers, or on our comparative where this already happens, at least now giving people on the ground a flow of information to believe in? Given that we are living in, given that America is already a country controlled by the white majority and information cannot be reached down, people aren't aware, we think that it's much better for us to have a less cooperative society, but at least one that is more aware of police custody and racism that happens there. Before my argument, yes.
When Martin Luther King isn't violent and faces police brutality, if a spotlight is shown, there is a clear moral comparative. But if these people are seen as violent, how can viewers see a moral difference when one is violent and the other is violent as well?
Sure, but all the current police abuse cases reported are ones it's not all current police abuse racist cases are reported, right? There's many of them that go, but police just use the excuse that it's of insidious racism, saying, oh, they look suspicious, or it was a drug crime, or we have evidence of this. All these insidious claims that we could never have otherwise preached, all the ones that we have already found out, good for us. But there are many things that happen under the cover, and this is what we want to find out when we have more scrutinization on every police officer. Argument, how the causes pursued by the Black Lives Matter movement should be reflective of racial struggles. We will say that because they are a social activist rights group, the struggles that the Black community faces has to embody the stances taken by the Black Lives Matter movement. What happens if we don't do this? We think the Black Lives Matter movement will lose traction and be seen as complicit. It's untrue that police brutality is fair. It's not a coincidence that it just happens to target a disproportionate number of African Americans. Supporters of the Black Lives Movement find the best support structure in one that is best accommodating towards their fights against racism and reflects your struggles. In this case in particular, they should take an anti-police stance because a lot of their problems have been caused by the police to begin with, and that is what best reflects what their struggles towards society. What is the harms if you don't do this? Number one, retribution to the victims of families. This means that African American communities feel most closure when the organization helping you explicitly chooses its fights and doesn't say some guy got killed by some guy killed a black an African American, but it was actually the police force. And the only reason we were supposed to know that there was actually insidious discrimination in Ferguson, a city historically known to be racist, only when we uncovered police custody, only when we uncovered that there was an anti-police stance there, as opposed to just saying somebody got killed. We have to highlight that it was the police and they are racist.
Thank you, Deputy Opposition. Start debate from closing houses. I'd like to call for a member of government to
Madam Speaker, Black lives do matter. We feel that it's extremely important for these Black lives to be protected as much as possible, especially by the police force. Who really is the biggest threat to a Black life in today's day and age? Is it really the policemen who go in there and racistly might kill a person on the street? We say no. It is actually the vast number of gangsters who live within these ghettos, who actively do perpetrate violence against the members in these ghettos. And we think that the police is an extremely necessary force in ensuring that people within ghettos are protected. This is the clash that we're going to bring about from closing government. We say that antagonizing the police is a direct threat to the safety of Black individuals who live within these disenfranchised communities. And secondly, we say that this sort of antagonism creates discourse and exacerbates the gun culture to a certain extent that helps certain anti-Black rhetoric that flies around in today's day and age in the first place. Our extensions are going to go along like this. One, why Black people in ghettos really need policemen to be present. Second, why antagonizing the policemen then strengthens this gang culture. And lastly, why the perception of Black people is then hurt in the long term. So let's first deal with this massive assumption that came about from opening opposition though. So OO ultimately said that there's going to be some degree of sensational media that looks into these issues and then tries to sensationalize them by making them a really big deal. And that's going to create some sort of change in the end. We think this assumes ultimately then that discourse is something that's constructive and actually leading to meaningful solutions being created to the issues that are being discussed within their case. So what sort of reactions ultimately do this sort of discussion evoke? Number one, we see that the policemen then become incredibly defensive and try to show themselves as ones who are not really that racist, or in the even worse spectrum, might actually exacerbate the sort of racism that they have within themselves and make them act out in even more violent ways towards the individuals on the ground. That's especially because of how specifically polarizing the form of discourse that they want to have is, because it's either like fuck the police or nothing at all then, because that's the ultimate stance the Black Lives Matter movement is taking. We think that this doesn't then stack up against OG's analysis on how Black Lives Matter ultimately creates a discourse that hurts individuals on the ground by not really resulting in some sort of change for them, because discourse can be had in constructive ways by more meaningful protests, by peaceful protests that ultimately can still highlight the issues that are being faced by these individuals, but ultimately doesn't result in the violent antagonism that is caused when you have much more polarizing forms of discourse that opening opposition wants to support on their side. And we think that this form of discourse is ultimately better. So let's first talk about protection that Black people need from policemen and what ultimately they need this for. We say that within the ghettos that a lot of Black people do live in, there are a lot of gangsters who live around there, people who ultimately do point guns at Black people as well, people who ultimately try to extort Black people within those communities, people whom Black communities don't really fear when they try to step out from their own houses in, because that ultimately is an area that does have high rates of crime that they need protection from. We think that ultimately this sort of gang culture is something that does harm Black people on the ground because especially they are unable to lead extremely meaningful lives and they are under constant threat of safety from within their own community and people then trying to hurt them. So what does the police do in this case? We think that at the very least, the police as a force then does have an incentive to protect people within these communities, especially because that means that some people are going to be saved in the process from this gang culture. But ultimately, we say that the gang culture then becomes extremely strong when you spread anti-police rhetoric in the way that state opposition wants to. Number one, because the policemen ultimately don't act as an organization that spreads out into these areas as well. The policemen themselves need some sort of incentive to go into these communities and then police them in the end. So especially when you have a large number of white policemen who are afraid that the Black communities within these areas are going to be antagonistic towards them, we think they have much less incentive to then step into these communities and then ultimately protect people on the ground from any sort of gang violence that does happen within these areas. We think that that is one simple reason why the policemen need to have a greater incentive to protect the lives of Black people on the ground. But before I move on, I'll take over.
Look, stop running towards your most convenient example of Fox News. If we at least have a higher dissemination of information, wouldn't this allow more awareness of police brutality in our side compared to none in yours?
Okay, look. Police brutality is something that is pointed out in many ways in today's day and age. It's not just Fox News, it's sensationalist stance that shows that Black people are acting out in such violent ways. That is the only form of discourse that people have. We think that you do have more moderate coverage of the follow-up to the Michael Brown incident, where people were actually extremely sad on the ground and lighting candles and things like that. When it comes to things like that, we think that ultimately tackles the whole culture of having some sort of racism within the police force, as opposed to the police as an organization being seen as something that's inevitably racist and works against Black people. We think the very differences in those nuances means that you tackle racism as a problem under our side, as opposed to the policemen being seen as some sort of antagonistic force on their side, which is not something that really achieves a change in the end. So when you then exacerbate the sort of gang culture on the ground, when they have a whole narrative of fuck the police going around, and that being the major narrative among Black people in general, we think that is when it becomes like easier for gangsters, number one, like spread their own violence and control their areas to a great extent. But secondly, it then hurts the kind of discourse that happens about these areas in the future in extremely harmful ways. Even Barack Obama says that African American people need to stop being violent, need to stop being gangsters, and ultimately pick themselves up, go to college, get an education, and lead better lives. We think that when you have this sort of narrative coming out from your first Black president within America, it ultimately shows that there is a widespread perception that Black people are gangsters and ultimately part of that whole gangster fuck the police community that you're trying to create. We think that when you have, number one, gang violence going up, when you don't have policemen within these communities, that ultimately gives ammunition to these individuals who are racist further to then spread such comments and spread such sort of discourse that ultimately harms the perception of Black people in the end. We think that that is extremely pernicious. But even further, we think that the Black people aren't able to help themselves when they aren't able to show that they themselves are improving and aren't the criminals that the white people want to perceive them as. We think the very fact that there is a vast perception then that these individuals are criminals, we should be working in every possible way to ensure that that crime is reduced so that we can save more Black lives, so that we can ensure that Black people do gain more mobility when they don't be seen as constantly violent people. For all these reasons, we propose.
Thank you, Robert. Let's call one of the
Before I begin my arguments, allow me to expose the whitewashed society that sad government has characterized the United States as. Now, being a white woman from Texas, the United States myself, I can guarantee you that no, not everyone watches Fox News and are rednecks who believe that the police are fantastic people who are truly serving justice. There are actually many critics of the police in the United States. It's funny how you said that people love them. That just made me laugh. And it's also, white people also stand for the idea of Black Lives Matter. Yes, this debate is how it affects the African American community, but essentially, society in itself can all stand for the Black Lives Matter movement. I can guarantee you that not many people agree with the idea that Zimmerman was seen as innocent. Now, let me get into rebuttals of the entire case in itself. My first rebuttal is the idea of hatred. The first speaker talks about how Black people will think that the police are against him. Now, I hate to break it to you, but the reality is already that Black people do think that the police are against them. Black people do discriminate, the police do discriminate against Black people and themselves. This isn't a reality we'll face if this movement gets bigger. This movement is already significant. No, thank you. The first speaker also, this idea just struck me as hilarious. He talked about the fact that we want friendly police officers. And if this movement goes up, then there will be friendly police officers. Do you think the man who killed Michael Brown was a friendly police officer? Do you think that the people who are persecuting these African Americans daily, who are putting them in jail for things that they might have not even done, are friendly police officers? Now, I hate to break it to you, this reality already exists. You talk about these issues like there's some utopia of an American society that they already live in, but these issues are already there. No, thank you. Now, the second speaker of the side government, I would like to ask you a question. Would you rather oppress the current people and the Black Lives Matter supporters instead of oppressing the people later on? Essentially, you're oppressing their right to fight for liberty. You're oppressing their right to fight for law and order, and you're silencing the existing minority that does fight for these rights. You would essentially destroy the opportunity for freedom of speech and freedom of oppression, two things that the society of the United States is built upon. If I'm a white woman and I'm not let into a building because I am white, you're saying I cannot fight that institution to be let into that building. You're saying I cannot stand up for what I believe in because I truly believe that is the best way to get where I would like to go. Yes, I will take your POI before I move on.
This debate isn't about whether you can or can't speak, but the method in which you achieve the political goals you want. You have to answer whether or not the violent, hateful message that you send co-opts the support of white as well as police officers in this part of the debate in order to achieve your political goals.
The anti-police statement that they are making, that is actually the motion in itself, is gaining support. It's gaining support from white people, as I had already proved to you. There are plenty of people who tweet the quote, hashtag Black Lives Matter. There are plenty of people who support this. It's not a whitewashed community where white people are like, yes, we love the police. We love the society that we live in. We love the treatment of the Black people in the society that we are in. And no, thank you. And my third rebuttal is the idea of agitating the police. Now, as I repeatedly said, this is already happening. You can't treat the police like a ticking time bomb. You can't act like they're a child where if I don't give them their ice cream, they will throw a fit. You cannot act like they're just going to explode if this whole movement catches fire, because I hate to break it to you, but it has already catched this fire. This treatment of the police points out how entirely fragile the institution itself is. You also don't address those who else support this movement in itself. The amount of fragile policemen that you have on your side would not even be able to make these changes that we want to make in our society. Our central idea is that the current police institution is based on the oppression, the systematic oppression and persecution of African Americans. We believe that the amount of African Americans that go to prison, the amount that gets stopped over in traffic stops, the amount that are seen as being sketchy. If a Black man is walking towards me with a hoodie on, the amount that the police see that as being something that they're doing wrong is systematically oppressive of African Americans in themselves. Now let me talk about our extension arguments. Now for one of our extensions, we would like to say that we would like to reform the perception of African Americans in themselves. Now, obviously, policemen have a very large role of power, and the perceptions of Black people have a sort of discrimination and predisposing ideas. Now, Black people are obviously discriminated against, which is the point we're trying to make. What we want to do is we want the policemen to use these positions of powers for good instead of bad. We want them to not systematically oppress these Black people. We do not want them to not support this Black Lives Matter movement and just oppress it more, because we believe that will send a message to the rest of society that it's okay to do that. That will send a message to the rest of society that it's okay for them to use their position of power to discriminate, and that's not something we want. We say that we want a message of open-mindedness to come across. We want the idea that not only Black people commit crimes and that these Black lives do matter. No, thank you. Our second extension is that we believe radical change is the most efficient change of reform. Now, you want to talk about how organic change will happen, but if you oppress this movement in itself, organic change won't happen. These people won't fight for their rights because they're too scared to, because the police officers are going to persecute them if they do. We believe that the system, how it is now, is systematically oppressive of African Americans. For example, Trayvon Martin. The man who murdered Trayvon Martin was a neighborhood watchman, and he claimed that he did it out of self-defense. He was found innocent. He was a neighborhood watch. He wasn't even a policeman. That is the systematic oppression of African Americans. No, thank you. This man was found innocent despite the fact that he had murdered this 14-year-old boy. This is what we want. We want just like the 1960s America, where people are allowed to fight for their rights, and they're allowed to fight for what they believe in. We believe, yes, once this radical change and this idea, this catching of fire of these ideas that come, we believe, yes, there will be chaos at the time, and it will be very hard to deal with, but we believe that the long-term effects are much more significant than that of short terms. We believe your organic change is not going to happen, because in historic America, it has not happened. Our third extension is that the position of power by the police is being taken advantage of, not even for just Black people, but for everyone. This is why we want radical reform. We believe that these anti-police statements will have true law and order, which is the basis of American police and judicial structure. Right now, it is not true law and order. Policemen are using their power to oppress certain groups of people. They're using their power to take out what their personal views are on whoever they feel like that day. They're using their power for the reasons that we believe are wrong. Now, to reiterate, the idea of hatred was not an idea that was clearly seen on this side. They like to whitewash society in a place where there's no hatred that already exists, and I hate to break it to you, but there is. To indicate our extensions in themselves, we believe that we want to reform the perceptions of African Americans in themselves by allowing police to reform that first. We believe radical change is the most efficient way of reform, and we believe the position of power is being taken advantage of. And for those reasons, I'm happy to propose. Thank you. Oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, member of opposition. Government debate for the side of government. I call upon the government.
Madam Speaker, this debate is ultimately a debate about the ramifications of violent antagonism against the police, right? That's what this debate is entirely about. It's not saying that we agree with everything that the police do, right? We think that's a hugely reductivist manner of dealing with this entire debate, right? That's not the fucking debate, lah. You know, the debate is how do we best choose to deal with this issue, right? And we tell you that the best way to deal with this issue is not to take an explicit form of violent antagonism towards the police because of the particularly pernicious narrative ramifications that arise from this that I'll proceed to talk about, right? But before that, some level of rebuttal, right? So let's deal firstly with our closing. Yeah. Okay, so firstly, we'd like to remind closing that we as a house exist now. You know, we as a society exist. Like closing government was not dealt with at all by closing opposition. Like our point about the ghettoized, the increasing victimization of people in ghettos was not dealt with at all. And without saying that,
We think that the level, the kind of extensions that could come from that were completely ignored as well. So we think that there was no engagement on any of our points by closing opposition rights. I like to point that out in the first place. But moving on, right? Let's deal with some of the things that they did talk about. So they said, oh, you know what? Like, not everyone like loves the police in America, right? Like it's not a hugely whitewashed like society. You know, even in Texas, there are people who think like, oh look, like what the police are doing is really bad. We tell you it's more nuanced than that, right? It's not just about the whitewashing of these communities. And I'll link this back to the to the prevalence of violence in ghettos later on. But first, let's deal with this, right? We tell you that ultimately it comes down to the questions of what you do when push comes to shove, right? Which is what a narrative of antagonism propagates. So no, it's like stop American. Like yeah. So what happens is that ultimately we think, Madam Speaker, that when a white middle income like family, general and person, right, has to choose between police security and fighting for black rights in a highly antagonistic and violent manner, they are going to choose police security, right? That's more important to them because the police are inherently on their side. So they can voice the opinion that look, what the police are doing is inherently wrong. But when push comes to shove, they aren't going to be on the side. The majority of them, the overwhelming majority of these people, and we can't characterize this overwhelming majority by one or two white people who are joining the ranks of Black Lives Matter, right? We think that the overwhelming majority of these people are not going to be on the side of Black Lives Matter, right? They aren't going to get the kind of majoritarian numbers that opening opposition wanted to talk about, right? So we tell you that on that count, the idea that they will raise like huge amounts of quantitative awareness and transcend racial lines is false. We tell you that that's not going to happen because security is on the side of these white people, right? And that's the choice they will make when it gets violent, which is what will happen when you espouse a narrative of violence. No, sit down. So moving on to the idea of, oh, issues are already there, right? We tell you that we are aware that the issues are already there. But moving on, what is this? More ammunition. No, sit down. More ammunition, racist commentary. Sorry. Oh yeah, we tell you that when you take like a narrative of antagonistic violence, what you do is that you feed the kind of you change the minds of moderates as well, right? And moderates within the police force as well, Mr. Speaker. And this is where I'm going to start talking about like the ghetto extension that Dash brought up and why it's actually highly relevant to this debate, right? We tell you that when you have like. Okay, so let's deal with some level of characterization first, right? We tell you, Madam Speaker, that Compton isn't the most violent place in America because of white police violence, right? We tell you that it's the most violent place in America because of black-on-black gang violence, right? And that's the kind of black-on-black gang violence that these communities have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. We tell you that the kind of policemen whose calculus is going to be affected by supporting Black Lives Matter are not the kind of policemen who are already racist to begin with. They're the moderate policemen who are forced in the reductive narratives of Black Lives Matter to be the bad guy, right? Bad guys, right? To be the police whom these Black Lives Matter people want to fuck over, right? And we tell you that when that's the kind of narrative antagonism, that's antagonistic narrative that's espoused, then obviously these police are going to have to act in an increasingly defensive manner, right? The thing that opening talked to you about, the idea that, oh, you know what, somehow like people are going to find policemen more approachable isn't going to be a thing. Like black people are going to find policemen more approachable isn't going to be a thing when these policemen, even the formerly moderate policemen, are going to be thinking, you know what, these black people are now out to explicitly fuck me over, right? Why on earth would that allow for why on earth would that allow for that black person to first approach you when they are considering you the explicit enemy, right? And secondly, why would that allow for the policeman who knows that you consider them to be the explicit enemy to think that this person is approaching me with good intent, right? We tell you that you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? You can't explicitly fuck over the legal system and then expect the legal system to come and have your back whenever you want it to, right? And we tell you that this affects these black lives on the ground, Madam Speaker. These black lives in these ghetto communities, right? Black lives whom, like these middle income, like white people, these one or two white people who find it highly sensationalist and fun to join Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter, because like it's kind of cool, like sensationalist, Beyonce's involved, like everyone wants a part of that cake, right? We tell you that these people are not hugely affected, disproportionately affected, not these one or two white people, no. Like, oh shit. Like, no, these people are not disproportionately affected by this what is it called? The Black Lives Matter movement, right? The people who are disproportionately affected are the people on the ground. Now, let's move on to why this links to the greater issues in this debate as well, right? Why this links to the greater issues in this debate is because, like, of the logical extension of Dasha's speech, right? When these people are perceived as criminals and are perceived as taking a violent, explicitly violent attitude, then they can't buy, like what I told you, they can't buy into the legal mainstream framework as well. And this is something that they've ignored since opening, right? The idea that the government and police force is not just white people, right? It's also black people as well. It is the right of black people, and black people are losing the right and legitimacy to access this channel, mainstream channel, when they explicitly take up an alternative channel that is explicitly antagonistic to this mainstream channel, right? Violently antagonistic to this mainstream channel. It means that you're going to lose access to the police. It means that you're going to lose access to the mainstream channels to change things, right? And we tell you that that's when the mainstream channel, including the police, like lose their onus to protect you because you have violently antagonized them. Then we tell you that that's when Black lives are going to suffer most, both on the ground and in terms of discourse as well. For these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank you, Babu. I'd like to call upon the opposition race to the direct part.
Ladies and gentlemen, do the means justify the ends? On our side, we say yes. Because when it takes more than 100 years after the abolishing of slavery, when it takes more than a 1960s civil rights movement, when that was not enough to bring about equal rights for Black people, then we think that the visibility brought by violent protest is a necessary reaction to this lack of progress. First, I will rebut this opening government's case, and then I'll rebut closing of government's case. First, what do we hear from this side? They said that the immediate reaction is that law enforcement is antagonized because they form pockets of opposition and they, instead of co-opting to the movement, and they don't form constructive progress, and that they create movements such as all lives matter that they seem to characterize as the antithesis of Black Lives Matter. And this is wrong for 3 reasons. First, All Lives Matter is not a legitimate movement. The few individuals in the police community or online who support this are a disregarded group. The All Lives Matter movement is not the antithesis of the Black Lives Matter movement, because Black Lives Matter is not against white people. It is against the police. It is against the institutional oppression of Black people. All Lives Matter is not grounded in a visible opposition and oppression that can be seen by the public, and it is not a movement that is supported by the American president himself or by Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. It is not a legitimate movement in that sense. Next, constructive engagement simply does not work because the system is built against Black people. They hold, if you say you want them to testify in court, they hold no credibility when they testify. They are poor, they live in inner city areas where they have no access to the rich lawyers that can support their causes and give them access to that freedom of speech that you seem to say that you already have in your world. And that is why we say that radical, violent opposition gives them the visibility and is a necessary reaction that the movement needs to protect African Americans. Thirdly, the police is kept in check by a growing majority of progressive and liberal thinking Americans, and even by people around the world, not just in America, who empathize with their cause. And that is more powerful than the simple racist camaraderie of the police that you seem to put up as this great thing that keeps them in check. So the political narrative is not just controlled by the police, it is controlled by a growing majority. Yes, I'll take your point.
You can speculate about the growth of progressives all you want, but the fact is Congress and Senate are controlled by Republicans. Can you tell us how you get their political support in reforming police at the point at which you say and confirm the bias against African Americans today?
Yes, we say that even if Congress blocks Obama's attempts at progress, we say that the visibility of violent oppression, of violent opposition is important to further that exchange, that discourse, until Congress changes its mind. We say that the narrative is not controlled by Fox News because the system is being called into reform by the most powerful man in America or in the world, Barack Obama, by Hillary Clinton, by Bernie Sanders, by people around the world, not just in America. So the narrative is not controlled by white racists like Donald Trump and Fox News. The majority is simply working against you, and it is a growing one. There are many more African Americans who are being oppressed and who are opposing this oppression than and opposing the entire legal system than the number of people who call for this tiny All Lives Matter movement. And lastly, on this side, they propose that violent opposition does not work because of a lack of a moral comparative, because violent against violent. But the violence of the police is a violence that is of oppression that is supported by institutional racism, whereas the violence of Black people is a reactionary violence to this oppression that is unfair and is based on negative stereotypes. Sit down. Now I rebut closing opposition's case. Their first point was that it will be a threat to the safety of Black people because it increases victimization of Black people. They are a threat already. They are a threat in America, and that is why we are debating this. They are being discriminated against already. It will not be worse on our side. It will be worse on your side. On our side, there will be more eyes on the police, more eyes on the violent, visible opposition that is committed, oppression that is committed against the Black community. Those eyes were not there before, and those eyes will not be there on your side because the Black, as I've already proved to you, the Black poor community does not have access to those eyes. They do not have access to the constructive means of progress that you say they will have. And if they did, why would they even take to violent means of opposition in the first place? No, thank you. Their second point was that it stops discourse. Well, we say that this encourages discourse that importantly is more controlled by the Black people who are being oppressed and who are opposing this, and that is a growing number. So this allows for the freedom of speech and the freedom of speech in whatever necessary means that they deem necessary for their cause that they call for. And this discourse will be had at a much higher level than the one that we are having now, because the progress that we have will lead to the reform of possibly Congress or lead to a path on that. And we say that discourse on that higher level than on minimal levels at just discussing among the police is a lot more effective and a lot more long lasting, especially for the Black movement that we all agree we want to support. And lastly, back to our case. Our first point was that it reforms the perception, negative perception of African Americans in society. George Zimmerman was able to kill a 14-year-old boy because of that negative perception, because so many people decided that it was so easy to believe that a 14-year-old Black boy could be guilty of something. Our second point was that radical opposition, radical violent opposition is the most efficient and necessary reaction to a long-lasting oppression and racism in America. So because the legal system itself does not allow access to these Black people, and because it systematically oppresses Black people, the visibility that is afforded to Black people through our side is more important in combating that institutionally racist legal system. And lastly, because we have combated this negative perception, and because radicalization simply works better because those 100 years of abolishing slavery has not worked, there is better protection for the African American community, because now the police can do their jobs better. Actual crime by all people, by all Black people, and even people in inner city areas can be prevented better because it is not just limited to unequal stop and frisk policies. And therefore, I'm so proud to propose.
Thank you, opposition. Does this propose? Shake hands and wait outside.
Is it for drawing? Yeah, it is for drawing. Yes, it is for drawing.